Ardennes Forest, May 1940. Just after 400 hours, the rumble began, a low thrumming that grew into a grinding roar as the 1st Panzer divisions punched through the seemingly impenetrable wooded terrain. This audacious thrust, bypassing the Maginot Line, was designed to shatter Allied expectations and encircle their forces in Belgium and northern France. Yet even as the spearheads advanced with astonishing speed, a critical vulnerability, unforeseen in its true scale, began to manifest itself, threatening to stall the entire offensive. Lieutenant Colonel Karl von Thoma, commanding the 3rd Panzer Regiment, watched from his command half-track as his Panzer IIIs, their 3.7-centimeter Quack 36 cannons swiveling, devoured the narrow forest roads. The initial reports from forward reconnaissance were exhilarating. Enemy resistance was fragmented, disorganized, but beneath the surface of this rapid progress, a quiet, insidious problem was brewing, far removed from the immediate chaos of combat. The Panzer III, the backbone of his regiment, weighed approximately 19.5 metric tons. Its Maybach HL-120 TRM engine, a 12-cylinder gasoline unit, produced 300 horsepower, allowing for a respectable road speed of 40 kilometers per hour. However, its operational range, on a full 450-liter tank of fuel, was a mere 165 kilometers on roads, dropping drastically to 105 kilometers cross-country. These figures, acceptable during peacetime maneuvers within Germany's robust infrastructure, were proving woefully inadequate for the sustained, high-speed exploitation now underway. Logistics officers, poring over consumption charts in makeshift field headquarters, noted a disturbing trend. Daily fuel expenditure rates, projected for a more methodical advance, were being exceeded by factors of 2 and 3. The sheer velocity of the Panzer divisions, designed to overwhelm and dislocate, was simultaneously outrunning its own supply chain. This was not a failure of tank design or crew training, but a fundamental miscalculation of the operational tempo that gasoline-powered armored warfare would demand over extended distances. The supply echelons, comprising hundreds of Opel Blitz trucks, themselves gasoline-powered and consuming significant quantities of fuel, struggled to keep pace. Each truck carried an average of 3,000 liters of fuel, but the distances stretched. Roads became congested with retreating enemy forces and advancing German infantry, and the sheer volume required to replenish thousands of tanks and support vehicles became an almost insurmountable challenge. The initial operational plans had underestimated the friction of war. The way every kilometer gained also extended the umbilical cord of supply. The implications were stark. A Panzer division, once committed, became a ravenous beast, consuming hundreds of thousands of liters of gasoline daily. Without this constant replenishment, the very machines designed for speed and shock would become immobile steel coffins, vulnerable to counterattack. The success of the Blitzkrieg hinged not just on the prowess of its tanks, but on an uninterrupted river of fuel flowing to the front lines. The calculations for the Eastern Advance, etched onto countless planning documents within the OKH, consistently underestimated the logistical burden of the new armored formations. These projections, often based on theoretical speeds and ideal terrain, failed to account for the brutal realities of sustained combat operations. The Panzer IV, once the backbone of the Blitzkrieg, consumed approximately 2.3 liters of fuel per kilometer on paved roads, a figure that dramatically increased to over 4 liters per kilometer across broken ground and through dense mud. The newer Panther and Tiger tanks, with their heavier armor and more powerful engines, presented an even more acute challenge. The Panther, weighing 44.8 tons, required around 4.8 liters per kilometer on roads, escalating to a staggering 7.5 to 8 liters per kilometer off-road. The Tiger I, a 56-ton behemoth, was even more profligate, devouring 7.5 liters per kilometer on roads and an astonishing 12 liters per kilometer across uneven terrain, a consumption rate that dwarfed anything previously encountered. These figures, meticulously documented in post-action fuel reports, revealed a critical disconnect between design specifications and operational reality. The sheer scale of these consumption rates, when multiplied by the hundreds of tanks deployed across vast distances, quickly overwhelmed existing supply chains. A single Panzer division, typically comprising 150 to 200 tanks, along with its myriad support vehicles, could easily consume hundreds of thousands of liters of fuel in a single day of active operations. This daily requirement, often exceeding 500,000 liters for a division on the move, was a logistical Everest that the planners had not adequately scaled. Pre-war planning had largely focused on the swift, decisive campaigns of 1939 and 1940, where distances were shorter and resistance often collapsed quickly. The operational tempo assumed in these early victories, with their relatively brief periods of sustained maneuver, did not prepare the logistical apparatus for the grinding, protracted battles of the Eastern Front. The very success of the Blitzkrieg had, ironically, fostered a dangerous overconfidence in the ability of the Wehrmacht to outrun its supply lines. The ideological imperative for rapid, overwhelming victory also contributed to this oversight. There was a prevailing belief that the sheer force of the armored thrust would negate the need for extensive logistical preparation, that the enemy would simply crumble before the advance. This conviction, while inspiring in its ambition, proved to be a fatal flaw in the practical application of armored warfare on a continental scale. The relentless demands of the new generation of tanks, however, presented an undeniable physical constraint that even the most fervent ideological conviction could not overcome. Eastern Front, summer 1942. The panzers of Army Group South, spearheading Case Blue, churned across the vast plains of the Don, their engines roaring a relentless, hungry song. This offensive, designed to seize the oil fields of the Caucasus, was predicated on speed and overwhelming force. Yet within weeks, the very fuel that powered this ambition began to falter, leaving the spearhead blunted and vulnerable. The initial thrust, a magnificent display of combined arms, saw tank divisions covering immense distances, often exceeding 50 kilometers a day, their logistical tails straining to keep pace. As early as July, unit diaries from the 24th Panzer Division recorded increasingly frequent halts, not for maintenance or enemy contact, but for lack of gasoline. These pauses, initially seen as minor inconveniences, quickly escalated into operational impediments, disrupting the carefully orchestrated rhythm of the advance. Fuel consumption rates for the Panzer IV Aust F2, a workhorse of the campaign, averaged 300 liters per 100 kilometers on road and significantly more cross-country. The heavier Tiger I, just beginning to appear on the front, devoured fuel at an even more prodigious rate, often exceeding 500 liters per 100 kilometers. These figures, while understood in principle during planning, proved catastrophic in the sprawling, under-resourced operational theater of the Soviet Union. The logistical infrastructure, already stretched thin by the sheer scale of the invasion, buckled under the demands. Rail lines, vital for bulk transport, were frequently damaged by partisan activity or simply insufficient in number to service the rapid eastward movement. Road networks, often unpaved and deteriorating, further exacerbated the problem, increasing transport times and vehicle wear. The supply chain, designed for a more contained European conflict, was simply not equipped for the vastness of the East. Interrogation files from captured German officers later revealed a recurring theme: the disbelief and frustration at the highest echelons. Generals, accustomed to the swift, decisive movements of the Blitzkrieg in Western Europe, found their most potent weapon, the armored fist, rendered inert by an invisible enemy, the empty fuel tank. The strategic implications were profound. Halted panzer groups, once the epitome of offensive power, became static targets, exposed to Soviet counterattacks and the relentless pressure of attrition. The operational reality became a grim cycle. An advance would begin, gain momentum, then grind to a halt, sometimes for days, as fuel convoys struggled to catch up. This allowed the retreating Soviet forces to consolidate, establish new defensive lines, and launch localized counteroffensives against the stalled German spearheads. The momentum, once lost, was difficult to regain, and the precious element of surprise evaporated with every stationary hour. Production logs from German refineries in 1942 showed a steady output of synthetic fuel, yet this was largely consumed by the Luftwaffe and the U-boat fleet, both considered strategic priorities. The Army, despite its immense demands, often received a lower allocation. This internal competition for resources, a symptom of a war fought on multiple fronts with finite means, directly translated into the empty fuel drums on the Eastern Front. The initial shock among commanders gradually gave way to a grim acceptance, but the operational consequences remained. The inability to sustain rapid armored thrusts against a resilient and numerically superior foe would ultimately define the limitations of the German war machine in the East. The vast distances and the insatiable appetite of their best tanks created a strategic vulnerability that no amount of tactical brilliance could overcome. The logistical nightmare extended far beyond the immediate battlefield. Germany's pre-war petroleum infrastructure, while robust for a peacetime economy, was never designed to sustain a continental war of rapid maneuver. The nation possessed a limited number of natural oil fields, primarily in the Hanover region, yielding a mere 2.5 million tons annually by 1939. This output represented a fraction of the Reich's wartime demand, forcing a critical reliance on synthetic fuel production. The synthetic fuel industry, a marvel of chemical engineering, aimed to bridge this chasm. Plants like Luna and Politz, utilizing the Bergius and Fischer-Tropsch processes, converted coal into liquid fuels. These colossal facilities, employing thousands of workers and consuming vast quantities of raw materials, became strategic targets for Allied bombers. A 1944 intelligence assessment noted that a sustained bombing campaign against these plants could reduce Germany's total fuel production by 90% within 6 months. Even when fuel was produced, its journey to the front lines was fraught with peril and inefficiency. The German railway network, though extensive, was increasingly strained by the demands of troop movements, equipment transport, and civilian supply. Tank cars, designed for bulk liquid transport, were often diverted or damaged, creating bottlenecks at every transfer point. A single Panzer division operating at full combat intensity could consume thousands of liters of fuel per day, a rate that quickly overwhelmed existing rail and road capacities. Road transport, intended as the final link in the supply chain, faced its own set of challenges. Germany's motor transport fleet, while initially impressive, suffered from chronic shortages of tires, spare parts, and adequate maintenance personnel. Trucks, often overloaded and driven on poorly maintained roads, broke down frequently. The average lifespan of a German military truck on the Eastern Front, according to a 1943 ordnance report, was less than 6 months. The distribution system itself lacked flexibility. Fuel was typically stored in large, fixed depots, vulnerable to air attack and partisan sabotage. Moving fuel from these depots to forward supply points required a complex ballet of trucks and personnel, often under enemy fire. The concept of a continuous, fluid pipeline of fuel, so crucial to modern mechanized warfare, remained largely aspirational for the Wehrmacht. This systemic inadequacy meant that even when strategic reserves existed, their timely delivery to the point of need was often impossible. Unit diaries from the Ardennes offensive detail instances where Panzer grenadier units, having advanced rapidly, were forced to halt for days, awaiting fuel convoys that were either delayed by traffic, destroyed by air attacks, or simply never dispatched due to a lack of available transport. The theoretical speed of the Blitzkrieg was repeatedly undermined by the physical limits of its logistical tail. The cumulative effect was a constant, gnawing anxiety among field commanders. Operational plans, drawn up with bold arrows sweeping across maps, invariably collided with the stark reality of fuel consumption rates and delivery schedules. The strategic implication was profound. Germany could initiate swift offensives, but sustaining them beyond a few hundred kilometers became increasingly improbable. The industrial capacity to produce the tanks was not matched by the infrastructure to keep them moving. The desperate measures taken to requisition fuel across the Eastern Front in the autumn of 1943 began to dismantle the already fragile logistical networks. Commands, often issued directly from Army Group headquarters, demanded the immediate diversion of all available fuel trains, regardless of their original destination or the priority of their cargo. This top-down imposition created a cascade of localized crises. As infantry divisions found their ammunition resupply delayed, artillery batteries stood idle for lack of transport, and medical units struggled to evacuate wounded, fuel became the singular currency of operational viability. Unit diaries from the 11th Panzer Division, for instance, record increasingly frantic requests for fuel, often concluding with the stark assessment, operations impossible without immediate resupply. The technical specifications of the Panther and Tiger tanks, designed for sustained, high-speed offensive operations, now became a liability. Their powerful Maybach HL-230, P-30, and HL-210 P-45 engines, while delivering formidable mobility and combat performance, consumed fuel at rates that dwarfed those of earlier German tank designs or their Soviet counterparts. A Panther, under combat conditions, could burn through over 700 liters of gasoline per 100 kilometers, a consumption rate nearly double that of a T-34. Production figures from the Reich Ministry of Armaments and War Production revealed a stark imbalance. While tank production, particularly of the Panther, ramped up significantly in late 1943, with monthly outputs exceeding 300 units. The corresponding increase in fuel refining and transportation capacity lagged far behind. The strategic implication was clear. Germany was producing weapon systems it could not effectively deploy. This created vast immobile stockpiles of new tanks at railheads, awaiting the arrival of fuel that was perpetually rerouted or simply non-existent. The ideological commitment to offensive warfare, ingrained in the Wehrmacht's doctrine, collided violently with the material realities of a multi-front war. Generals, accustomed to the swift, decisive movements of the Blitzkrieg, found their most potent weapons paralyzed by an invisible enemy, the empty fuel tank. This forced a strategic reevaluation, but often too late, as the initiative on the Eastern Front had already shifted irrevocably. The quiet hum of a Maybach engine, once a symbol of German power, now represented an insatiable drain on a dwindling resource. The scramble for fuel became a zero-sum game, pitting army against army, division against division, for dwindling supplies. This internal competition further fractured the command structure and eroded unit cohesion, as local commanders increasingly resorted to unauthorized requisitions and even armed escorts for their fuel convoys. The once vaunted German logistical efficiency, a cornerstone of their early war successes, dissolved into a desperate, uncoordinated struggle for survival. The shadow of empty fuel cans stretched long across the vast plains of Russia. The exhaustive post-campaign analyses compiled in the spring of 1943 from regimental after-action reports and quartermaster summaries painted a stark and undeniable picture of logistical overstretch. These internal Wehrmacht documents, often marked Nur für den Dienstgebrauch, detailed a systemic failure to provision forward elements adequately, with fuel emerging as the most critical and consistent bottleneck. The initial shock among senior commanders had solidified into a grim understanding of their army's inherent limitations, a realization that transcended the immediate tactical setbacks. A closer examination of the fuel consumption rates for armored divisions revealed the profound disparity between theoretical planning and battlefield reality. The Panther, for instance, with its Maybach HL-230P30 engine, consumed approximately 3.5 liters of fuel per kilometer on paved roads, a figure that could more than double to 7.5 liters per kilometer in cross-country operations, particularly over soft ground or during combat maneuvers. The larger Tiger I, powered by the same engine, exhibited even more prodigious thirst, often exceeding 10 liters per kilometer in challenging terrain. These figures meticulously recorded by maintenance crews and supply officers, far outstripped the projected consumption rates used in pre-war logistical models, which had often assumed more favorable terrain and less intense operational tempos. Comparing these consumption rates to the daily fuel allocations revealed the impossible arithmetic confronting field commanders. A typical Panzer division, comprising around 150 tanks, 100 armored personnel carriers, and thousands of support vehicles, required upwards of 200,000 liters of fuel per day for sustained operations, even at moderate speeds. Production logs from the Reich Ministry of Armaments and War Production indicated that while overall fuel output remained substantial, the capacity for refining high-octane aviation and tank-grade gasoline, particularly synthetic fuels, never consistently met the escalating demands of a multi-front war. The qualitative deficiency in available fuel, often lower octane than specified for optimal engine performance, further exacerbated consumption and maintenance issues. The strategic implication of this fuel deficit was profound, shifting the operational paradigm from one of rapid, decisive encirclement to a grinding attrition. The Blitzkrieg doctrine, predicated on swift, deep penetrations and continuous movement, became increasingly untenable as armored spearheads were forced to halt, awaiting precious fuel convoys. This logistical vulnerability allowed enemy forces to regroup, consolidate defenses, and often counterattack, negating the initial tactical advantages gained by superior German armor and training. The ideological promise of an unstoppable war machine, propagated through newsreels and official pronouncements, began to fracture under the weight of these mundane, yet utterly debilitating, material constraints. The quiet reflection among the general staff, documented in their private correspondence and later memoirs, centered on a dawning awareness that the war was no longer a matter of tactical brilliance or individual heroism. It had become a war of resources, a brutal calculus of oil wells, refinery output, and railway capacity. The once unquestioning belief in German industrial superiority had given way to a sober acknowledgement of its finite limits, particularly when confronted by the combined economic might of the Allied powers. The engine's growl, once a symbol of power, now carried the unspoken question of its next refuel. The after-action reports, meticulously compiled from frontline observations, logistical manifests, and even captured enemy documents, presented a stark and undeniable truth. The Panther and Tiger tanks, while formidable in their individual engagements, were cripplingly thirsty, their operational range severely curtailed by an insatiable demand for fuel. This data, a relentless drumbeat across every theater of conflict, from the frozen steppes of the East to the sun-baked dust of North Africa, was disseminated through the Wehrmacht's command structure, reaching the highest echelons of the general staff. The technical specifications of these heavy tanks, celebrated in propaganda as symbols of German engineering prowess, were themselves a testament to this inherent flaw. The Maybach HL230P30 engine, a 23-liter V12 power plant generating 700 horsepower, propelled the 57-ton Tiger I. Its fuel consumption, documented in the Technische Dienstvorschriften, stood at an average of 480 liters per 100 kilometers on roads and an astonishing 790 liters per 100 kilometers cross-country. For the 45-ton Panther, with its similar Maybach HL230P30, the figures were only marginally better, at 300 liters per 100 kilometers on roads and 500 liters per 100 kilometers off-road. These numbers, when extrapolated across an armored division comprising hundreds of such vehicles, painted a logistical nightmare. A single Panzer division, typically equipped with around 150 tanks, alongside its myriad support vehicles, half-tracks, trucks, reconnaissance cars, could consume hundreds of thousands of liters of fuel in a matter of days during sustained operations. Fuel transport, primarily by rail and then by vulnerable road convoys of 2.5-ton Opel Blitz trucks, each carrying perhaps 2,000 liters, became an enormous bottleneck. The Allied air superiority, steadily increasing from 1943 onwards, compounded this vulnerability, turning every fuel convoy into a potential inferno. The Kriegstagebuch entries often detailed the agonizing waits for replenishment, sometimes stretching for days, rendering entire armored formations inert. Despite this overwhelming empirical evidence, the strategic planning for future campaigns continued to emphasize offensive thrusts reliant on these heavy armored formations. The allure of the superior firepower and armor of the Panther and Tiger proved too strong to overcome the logistical realities. Production targets for these tanks remained high, driven by a belief in their tactical superiority, even as the fuel supply lines grew thinner and more precarious. The Panzer program of 1944, for instance, still aimed for significant increases in heavy tank output, a testament to this persistent strategic oversight. The ideological commitment to qualitative superiority, a hallmark of German military doctrine, overshadowed the quantitative constraints of fuel and transport capacity. The focus remained on developing ever more powerful weapons, with the expectation that tactical brilliance and engineering excellence would somehow overcome the material limitations. This persistent disconnect between battlefield reality and strategic ambition would continue to plague German operations, culminating in the critical shortages that crippled major offensives in the war's final years. The lessons, though clearly presented, were not truly learned. The temporary respite offered by captured reserves and hurried diversions was just that, a pause. The underlying structural fragility of the German war machine's fuel supply remained, a systemic vulnerability that would metastasize with each subsequent advance. The logistical calculus, already strained by the vast distances of the Eastern Front, would only become more punitive as the war progressed, demanding ever greater quantities of a resource that was becoming increasingly scarce. Every kilometer gained, every city captured, extended the supply lines, amplifying the existing inefficiencies in transport and distribution. The reliance on rail, while efficient for bulk transfer, was inherently rigid and susceptible to interdiction. The sheer volume of fuel required to sustain mechanized warfare on multiple fronts began to outstrip the Reich's industrial capacity and its access to raw materials, even before the full weight of Allied strategic bombing campaigns began to bear down on synthetic fuel plants. The initial shock of stranded panzers, a stark lesson in the operational limits imposed by fuel, was absorbed and temporarily mitigated. Yet, the remedies applied were often stopgap measures, drawing from dwindling reserves or relying on the fleeting bounty of occupied territories. These solutions did not address the fundamental imbalance between an ambitious military strategy and the finite resources available to execute it. The very success of the Blitzkrieg had, in a perverse way, masked these deep-seated weaknesses, creating an illusion of invincibility that obscured the precariousness of its logistical underpinnings. The rapid advances into France and the Low Countries had been fueled by pre-war stockpiles and the swift seizure of enemy depots, creating a false sense of abundance that would not endure. The subsequent campaigns, particularly the vast sweep into the Soviet Union, would expose this illusion with brutal clarity. The distances, the climate, and the sheer scale of the conflict would magnify every logistical miscalculation. The initial operational surprise of fuel shortages would evolve into a chronic, debilitating condition, constraining strategic options and ultimately dictating the pace and even the possibility of offensive action. The strategic implications were profound. A military designed for rapid, decisive thrusts found its momentum increasingly throttled by the mundane reality of empty fuel tanks. The operational freedom of commanders, once a hallmark of German armored warfare, became progressively curtailed, replaced by a constant nagging anxiety over fuel allocations. The lessons learned, or perhaps more accurately, the lessons experienced during these early encounters with fuel starvation were deeply unsettling for the high command. They understood, intellectually, the importance of logistics, but the visceral reality of immobile tanks, the pride of their fighting force, brought a new urgency to the problem. Yet, the solutions implemented were often reactive, designed to patch immediate holes rather than fundamentally re-engineer a system already operating at its breaking point. The long-term consequence was an incremental but inexorable erosion of operational flexibility. The strategic initiative, once firmly in German hands, would gradually slip away, not always due to battlefield defeat, but often due to the prosaic fact that the engines of war could not be kept running. This systemic weakness, evident in the early campaigns, would become a defining characteristic of the later war, a constant drag on every major offensive. By the autumn of 1944, for instance, daily fuel consumption on the Western Front alone, according to German General Staff report,